Shayne, welcome to the Financial Institutions MBA class at Melbourne Business School.
Thank you very much.
And anyway, if you'd like to say a few words before we start with the questions.
No, I'm really interested to hear the questions. I'm interested to what's on people's mind. I mean, I think it's just a really interesting time to be in our industry. We're going through, I mean, I guess we always are. We're always going through change. I mean, our company's almost 200 years old, and we're still building, and we're still building a better bank. And I think what's been really interesting over the last couple of years, but not just because of COVID, but partly because of that, is just the extreme amount of change and disruption and new thinking that our entire industry is going through. And you can think of those as challenges, and they are, but they're also massive opportunities. And so it's an exciting time for those that are interested in the banking sector.
Indeed. Okay, well, why don't we begin then with some questions about the new way of working and the agile transformation. So our first question comes from Syndicate 2.
Hi, Shayne, it's Ding here, and thanks for joining the cast. So the question is very similar. I guess the first part you already heard is, we saw you attribute agile ways of working to the speed launch of the Apple Pay within 10 weeks. So we're interested to know, were there any particular learning points or stumbling blocks in relationship to the agile that you picked up during the process?
Sure. I might actually give you a bit of context on why we even thought about it. So I think it's fair to say, before I was CEO, I'd never heard of agile. It's not something I was familiar with or had any experience with. And in fact, our strategy at the time, and it still is, and I won't go through all the boring details, was essentially around this idea that if you want to really succeed and deliver great outcomes for customers, at the core of that is this essence of speed. And that what you need to be able to do is you need to be able to understand how demand and desires are changing in the marketplace. You need to be able to see and scan the world for opportunity, and you need to be able to respond at pace, right? And we said at the time, there were two really important ingredients in that pace. One was the creativity of our people, so that growth mindset. Did we have people, and in my language, that was sort of the software of we had. Did we have people who were curious, outward looking, could observe, listen, adapt, and see what customers needed and figure out what that would imply? And then that was the software. And then the hardware was the delivery. And our products today are essentially all digital. It's all really about the technology, the way that we solve problems for people, whether that's a home loan or trade finance or foreign exchange. And so we had this plan around the software and the hardware. And so we know we had to rebuild the architecture. It was only when I brought in a new head of technology who'd never worked in a bank before, right? So I wanted some fresh things. He'd never worked in a bank. He came from a big data background. And I said to Jared, you know, you better learn something about banking. I'll take you on a little world trip when you could do those things 5 years ago. So I took him, I said, look, if you want to see the future, we can go to China and we can see how an economy is completely leapfrogged technology that we take for granted, and they're completely in a different sphere. That would be interesting, although that's not really relevant for us because that's not our place. If you want to see the past, if you want a history lesson, we can go to the United States and we can go and see how they use checks still as a predominant means of payment. And their whole thing is about digitizing checks. And it's a very actually quite scary traditional sort of world. But if you want to see contemporary banking and going through transformation, we go to Europe and Northern Europe. So that's what we did. And along that trip, we ran into a company that we know really well, ING in the Netherlands. And we happened to be there at a time that they were going on this massive agile transformation. And we were there and they were saying, like, literally tomorrow morning, we're launching this huge ship. And so we got really interested in it. And I became really excited about it. And I realized it was the missing link. We had the software and the hardware, and we didn't have like the operating system that made them talk to each other. And so the operating system in my mind was this agile way of working, which we called new ways of working. Yeah. And it was essentially about, how do you break work? And you all know the theory. How do you break work down into bite-sized chunks? Get the right people for the task at hand, and break that work into short delivery cycles. Test and learn, get the feedback, and keep adapting. And so that was this idea. And when we first got into it, it was really interesting. It was almost like we ended up having this almost philosophical war in the company. There are two types of people who approached agile. There were the sort of religious conservatives. The people are, the Agile Manifesto, which is like a book, and there are certain ways of doing things that it's prescribed. Yeah, and you must do this and you must do that, as opposed to the more sort of free neoliberal sort of view of agile, which is it's not about the book and the manual, it's a way of thinking and a way of being. It's a way of being liberal. It's a way of ultimate flexibility. And so we ended up in this a little bit of a cultural war, and it wasn't a war, but debate in the company. And one more important point there, and we might talk about it in your other questions, was then the next thing. So we went into that. We then ended up with this issue about we didn't transform the entire company. And I heard one of you answer a question at the end, and I think it was bang on. The contact center question was a really good one. You realize that not all work is appropriate for that way of working, and there are rituals in a bank that have a very strong rhythm to them. Board meetings, regulatory reporting, shareholder reports, quarterly financials. Those things happen in a certain way, and so there was this tension between the traditional sort of waterfall approach and deadlines of things and this agile way of working. And the question was, how do we resolve at the points of integration? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we solve those with sort of these flashpoints, and how do we resolve some of those issues, which are some of the challenges that we learned along the way and still do. And there's no easy answer to that.
Very, very good. Very interesting. Okay. Our final question for tonight also concerns new banking roles and products, and it's from Group 3.
Hi, Shayne. Our group is really curious about the elevation of data and automation agenda at ANZ by way of adding a new role in your executive team. What objectives and new possibilities did you have in mind in making this change? And can we expect to see more and more smarter applications and tailored products in the future that are hyper-personalized to individual customers' journeys and ambitions?
Yeah, so the answer to the second part is yes. So I worked at Citibank for 20 years, and that's sort of where I grew up. And the CEO, way before my time, there's a bit of a banking legend in Sydney. There's a guy called Walter Wriston. And Walter Wriston, who's the CEO and chairman, made a comment that, someday in the future, the information about money will be more valuable than the money itself. Yeah. And so that was sort of a prophetic thing about the value of data. And that says, as I mentioned before, our customers trust us with their money. And actually, as part of that relationship, they're actually trusting us with this data. We have unbelievable amounts of data on all of you that are customers with our bank. We know so much about what you do, how you live your life, where you shop, what you think is important. We have a pretty good ability to predict what you're going to do next in terms of we can see the patterns and all of that stuff. Yeah, it's an enormous responsibility and to manage that and use it for good things. But of course, the data is just mind-boggling in terms of its depth. And the real question is, how do we utilize it for good? And so how do we utilize that data so that we can help people achieve their aims in life? And so that's why, and it's not a core skill of a bank typically. We typically look at data. The most common thing that people will look for from data in a bank is from a risk perspective. The data tells me that David didn't pay his credit card last month. That's a red flag. So we're good at that sort of, even to the extent I can see, a customer or a business as their revenue is falling fast. I can see the data and that sets off flags. So we use data very much in a risk awareness flat sort of sense. But actually what we're learning more and more about is we actually have the opportunity we actually know, we didn't necessarily know this, but we know a lot about the positive things as well. And by using a lot of the AI tools and big sort of data analytics, we can actually identify, as I said, literally, we can see when a person is saving for a home. We can see it through their behavior. Right? And so that ability to utilize that data for good customer outcomes and that benefit the bank is enormously powerful. We did just to finish up, David, I know we're out of time, but we did a really interesting piece of work. We've got 30 data scientists, PhDs who work in the bank. And one of the pieces of work we did with our customer data, and it's all anonymized, And we did this with Qantas. So we take their Qantas frequent flyer data, we take our data, we mash it all together, and we look at these insights. So Qantas know that, David flew from, Canberra to Adelaide on Thursday or whatever. Yeah. So they know that. But what we know, if he's a credit card customer, we know how he got to the airport, right? Did he go in a cab? Did he get an Uber? Where did he stay when he got off the, did he stay in a hotel? Where did he eat? What car did he rent or whatever? We know all of that. So we know more about the end-to-end journey of David and that trip, which is a massive insight to Qantas to know what their customers' actual behavior. And then we even know things, one of you mentioned working in an energy company. We also know the predilection of the Qantas customers to choose, AGL over Energy Australia or something. Now, you might say some of that stuff. We found out that, we did the same work with Vodafone. And so getting those insights is massively valuable for those companies. And it's a question of how do you sort of monetize that and build a whole business around it in terms of data. And I think that's a really, really exciting opportunity that the banks can be part of.
Well, thank you. I think that's all the time we have, but I wanted to thank you, Shayne, for honoring us with your presence and enlightening us with your really interesting answers. And I think that we've, for me at least, it's been very edifying and eye-opening. And it's just been such a great pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thanks for inviting me along, David. I really appreciate the opportunity. I mean, I know you'll all work in different areas, and in banking may or may not be on your agenda, but it's an interesting field. And I think the interesting part of it is it actually touches all parts of the economy and community. And so we're like part of a lifeblood of the system. And so we have a really big obligation to the broader community in terms of how we behave and what we do. And, it's a privilege to be asked along and talk about a little bit about ANZ, but about the industry in total. So thanks for the opportunity.